Now, I want to touch on decision making for a moment, because while this course isn't focused on incident management or leading an incident response team directly, the reality is everyone involved in incident response is constantly going to be making decisions. Even as a responder or an analyst, we're making high impact decisions all the time, often under pressure. Incident response is a high pressure, high stakes environment. Incidents move fast, and information and scope of incidents, as we've talked about, is often very incomplete at first. And we talked about how containing and eradicating too early without knowing the full scope of an incident can be devastating, right? We can very quickly lose the advantage that we have over the adversary. We can alert them of our presence and cause them to switch techniques, or maybe pack things up and move elsewhere in the network, or in some cases burn the environment to the ground behind them. However, if we delay containment for too long, the adversary moves deeper into our network and closes in on their actions on objectives. Right? At every stage of an investigation, we're making these high-impact decisions and having to weigh our options carefully. And so I find that there are certain concepts or mental models like the one we're going to visit here that really help, perhaps more consciously at first, but the long-term goal is to subconsciously guide and influence more calculated decision-making. And so, not to sound overly dramatic, but we are at war with the adversary. And I often like to picture it as a strategic chess game, but it can also be interpreted as an outright war, right? In this case, a war that's fought over a digital battlefield. And like any war or battle, our success depends on our ability to adapt and respond effectively in fast-moving and uncertain situations. One framework that captures this concept well is called the OODA Loop, which was developed by military strategist John Boyd. And John Boyd was a United States Air Force pilot and a Pentagon consultant between 1945 and 1975. And not to get too much into a history lesson here, but basically, drawing from his experiences in the Vietnam War, Boyd proposed that the success in future wars and conflicts would depend less on overwhelming firepower, right? So not so much on who has the stronger artillery or the more devastating weaponry, but much more on the ability to quickly gather, process, and act on information. And in the 1970s, he formalized this idea into the OODA Loop, which is a decision-making model that's designed to guide effective responses during crises and high-stakes situations. And fittingly enough, this model was originally designed to help fighter pilots survive and win in dogfights, right, or these air-to-air combat scenarios where decisions had to be made in seconds and milliseconds with life-or-death consequences. And since then, the OODA Loop itself has been applied more generally, beyond just military strategy, and has influenced decision-making within many different fields, and cybersecurity being one of them. And what we have here is a continuous cycle where the results of each action we take are observed, and the loop repeats itself to adapt to changing circumstances. And the core idea is to cycle through this process faster than our opponent to gain an advantage. And so when following the model, decision-making happens in an iterative cycle of observe, where we gather information from the environment, orient, where we analyze and interpret the situation that we're in, decide, where we make an informed choice on a course of action based on our orientation and understanding of the environment, and act, where we actually execute the decision. And the idea here is that the entity or the person or organization who can process this cycle faster and more effectively than an opponent can gain the advantage, right? By observing and orienting, deciding, and acting faster than the adversary, we can get inside of their decision cycle and disrupt their ability to execute their attack effectively, right? We can more or less force them into a reactive position where they quickly fall behind and lose control over the engagement. And again, this isn't a one-time process, right? It's a continuous loop or a continuous cycle throughout the entire investigation, in our case. As soon as we make a decision and act on it, well, new information is going to become available, right? And we cycle back to observing and orienting, deciding, and acting once again. And like I said, although the OODA Loop was originally designed for fighter pilots, the same principles apply in cyber defense and incident response, right? Every incident we deal with is a moving target. Every step the adversary takes can change the situation, and every move we make as a responder can then influence the adversary's next action. And importantly, the adversary is moving through their own OODA loop, right? Every delay or oversight in our response gives them more time and opportunity to adapt. And we talked all about containment and eradication strategies before, and this is exactly where the attacker can gain an advantage if we don't act strategically. Right? Our goal is to cycle faster and better, to sort of outpace the adversary and disrupt their plans and regain control of the environment. And so let's look a bit deeper at each stage, because it's a great way to frame what exactly is going on in the network during an attack. And so first off, we have the observe phase, right? And observation is all about information and data, specifically collecting relevant data. In the original air combat context, this quite literally meant scanning the skies, right? Looking at different visual cues and trying to identify aircraft and distinguish friend or foe, right? Sometimes using various cockpit instrumentation to assist in those efforts as well. In cybersecurity, we have a ton of similarities. Observation really just means continuous monitoring, right? Monitoring our network, our systems and endpoints for anomalous activity. It means making sure that we're collecting relevant logs and setting up alerts and centralizing our telemetry, right? And so to gain the upper hand against adversaries, we need comprehensive visibility, right? So more and better and faster data. And that includes evidence sources like event logs from our endpoints and servers, right? Different network traffic and flow data. Maybe alerts from our intrusion detection or EDR tools, maybe file system and memory forensics and threat intelligence, right? The list really goes on here, and we'll talk about some of the most valuable and important telemetry sources in the next module. But more than just collecting a boatload of data, it's really about making sure that our data is timely and relevant and high quality. We can think back to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a very old poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And how the story sort of goes is, there's a captain and a ship, and they're trailing through these icy waters, sort of being led by an albatross. And this albatross is sort of seen as this symbolic effort that is guiding them through these icy waters. But for some reason or another, again, I won't spoil the entire story. There's some, deep symbolism and analogies in there. But the captain has this impulsive act of shooting down that albatross with his crossbow. And after which, the ship and the crew very quickly become disoriented and end up just lost entirely in these desolate waters around the equator. And with the sun beating down on them for days, they very quickly become dehydrated and dying of thirst. And that's where we get the famous line or the famous phrase of water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. And sort of the irony here of, the sailor on a ship surrounded by ocean, yet unable to find any fresh water to drink, right? Where something is so abundant, but just inaccessible or unusable to us. And that's what an overwhelming amount of noise in log collection can quickly do to analysts, right? And so we need to know how to work with and parse and cut down an overwhelming amount of data quickly. And that's something that we're going to be focusing on all throughout the course. And we sometimes need tooling and instrumentation to help us observe our environment at scale within enterprise networks. And so to summarize here, again, having a strong observation is really going to set the stage for every other part of the loop, right? If we fail to see what's happening or maybe misinterpret what we do see, well, we're already behind and we lose that advantage over the adversary. Now for the second phase here, we have orient, right? Orientation is the most intellectually demanding phase of the OODA loop. It's really where we begin to make sense of what we've observed, right? It's sort of the stage here where all of that raw data or information that we're collecting or interpreting becomes actionable insight. But it's also more than just analysis. It's about changing our perspective, right? Orientation is shaped by how we see the world, right? Our current understanding and assumptions, our different biases, maybe our training and experience and ultimately our goals. And even often, whether we like it or not, our emotional state, right? It sort of defines the lens in which we interpret our observations. And importantly, we can't observe what we aren't oriented to see. And this is where things like situational awareness comes into play. Orientation means assessing where we are, right? And what's going on around us and how that aligns or maybe contradicts with our goals, right? This kind of idea of perception versus reality. And so we'll continue to talk all about our methodology as we navigate through the course. But sort of this idea of starting at scale, maybe from a wide lens or a zoomed out perspective. And as we identify areas of interest within the network or within various endpoints, well, we begin to zoom in and narrow our focus to those interesting entities. And this process will allow us to dedicate our efforts in performing more detailed forensics, for example, on a more manageable set of systems to help us map out the adversary's actions and understand the full timeline of an attack, including things like its root cause. Right? In air combat, if a pilot isn't correctly oriented to the fight, if they lose track of the enemy or maybe misjudge their altitude, well, they simply cannot win, right? The same is true in cyber defense. If we're disoriented or if we're chasing the wrong actions or indicators or misunderstanding the threat actor's objective and not being able to forecast correctly or maybe misinterpreting what the evidence is actually telling us, well, we give the adversary a major advantage. Strong orientation can give us leverage, right? It can place us in a position where we can act effectively while forcing the adversary to reorient, right? If we can make the attacker spend time and effort just trying to understand the new situation we've created, well, then we're the ones that are taking that advantage. And so while observation can tell us what is happening, orientation can help us understand why it's happening, right? And what that means and what might happen next. It sort of connects the dots there. Right, so in our context, this can involve things like correlating data across different sources and maybe building up a timeline or a chain of events that the attacker or affected systems have gone through. Right, or maybe understanding context, such as whether an indicator or a finding that we come across is part of routine or baseline activity within the network, or if it's an early sign of an intrusion. And in general, just being able to identify patterns and recognize attacker behavior, right? So things like lateral movement and privilege escalation. And ultimately being able to filter out noise. And so our attention is focused on what truly matters. And like I touched on, a well-oriented team can use things like forecasting to anticipate the attacker's next move and identify what their objectives might be, and ultimately allow us to prepare a more effective response. But we need to make sure that we're properly oriented first before we take action. Right? Think back to the incident response process. If we skip straight to eradication before fully orienting ourselves, we risk misjudging the scope of the incident. Right? We might clean up one infected host while missing a second or a third persistence mechanism somewhere in the environment. Right? We might restore a system without realizing lateral movement has already occurred and there are more affected systems. Premature action without full orientation is often going to lead to incomplete remediation and effectively reinfection, or worse, escalation of the attack. Now, this brings us to the third stage, or as you can see here, decide, right? Once we've observed the environment and oriented ourselves to the situation, the next step is to decide on the best course of action. And so this is where we run through our available options and consider their possible outcomes and really mentally simulate how each action might play out. Importantly, we're making decisions based on what we understand about the threat, our environment, and our own objectives from the observe and orient phases. Right, so our goal here is to choose a response that gives us the best chance to regain control, or in this case, contain the threat or move closer to resolution. Right? And again, the quality of our decisions that we have access to is going to depend entirely on the strength of the first two stages. Right? If we have bad or incomplete data that we would find in observation, or if we misunderstood the threat or the context that we would do in orientation, well, then the options that we come up with might be flawed or highly limited. Right? The effectiveness of the decide phase is directly tied to the quality of our prior analysis. And so again, more relevant to our context, the decide stage might involve things like prioritizing actions based on risk and impact, or the urgency of an incident, or evaluating containment strategies that we've talked so much about already. And importantly, again, like we talked about, being able to balance speed against business operation disruption, right? A lot like we talked about with containment and eradication, sort of the ability and the need to collaborate with other teams or stakeholders or data owners when needed to make these decisions. And so again, this might mean choosing between isolating a system immediately or continuing to observe for a bit longer in order to gather more intelligence. Right? It can involve deciding whether to block a domain or disable a user account, or maybe pull in legal or executive teams to consult on these decisions and their business and legal impact as well. Because ultimately, poor decision making, especially under pressure, is often the result of skipping or rushing over the orient phase. And so that's why taking time to align our understanding before deciding is so important. If we're making blind or uninformed decisions without this initial insight, we can very quickly make the situation worse, right? Again, we can alert the attacker prematurely or really just allow critical evidence to be lost. And so really the decide stage is the turning point between understanding sort of what we know and taking action, right? So what we're going to do about it. And this brings us to our fourth and final stage, which is act. And act is a simple stage, right? It's just where we execute the decision that we've made. It's the moment where the planning becomes action. It's where we test our hypothesis or the decision that we've chosen in hopes that we gain an advantage, or in our case, contain the threat or move closer to resolution. And acting allows us to see whether our understanding was correct, right? Whether our response was effective, and whether we've disrupted the adversary's momentum. And so again, in incident response, this really just means the execution of whatever decision we might be faced with at various stages of IR. Right? So isolating an endpoint or moving a system to a quarantine network segment, maybe blocking a malicious IP or domain, maybe re-imaging a compromised system or resetting credentials. And of course, the list goes on here. But importantly, the act stage doesn't end the loop, right? It feeds directly back into it. Every action we take creates new observations, new changes to the environment, and prompts new behavior from the adversary. And so as soon as we act, well, we begin the loop all over again, right? We observe the result, we reorient ourselves to the new situation, and decide on the next move. And if our hypothesis was correct, well, we gain ground against the adversary. And if it wasn't, well, we now have more and better information to refine our next decision. Right? The goal here is, again, that cycle to continuously learn, adapt, and improve with each time around the loop. And so at a high level here, again, the OODA loop isn't just a sequence of steps, it's that continuous cycle. And the real power comes from how quickly and effectively we can turn that loop, and specifically turn it against the adversary. Right? The faster we can move through observe, orient, decide, and act, the harder it becomes for an attacker to respond in a meaningful way. In fact, if we turn our loop fast enough, we begin to disrupt the adversary's own OODA loop, right? They become disoriented. Their situational awareness erodes. Every move they take becomes more costly and slower and riskier. And that's the advantage that we're aiming for. Right? And so really, whether we're dealing with a phishing campaign or a malware infection or some kind of advanced persistent threat pivoting around our network, the OODA loop gives us a mental model for how we can regain the initiative. Right? We win not just by defending, right, or sort of having heavy artillery and weaponry, but specifically by disrupting the attacker's decision-making cycle and outpacing them, staying ahead of their moves and forcing them to react to us. And remember, regardless of how successful our last action was, the cycle immediately begins again, right? We return to observing the outcome of our action and orienting to any new developments or knowledge, and then making our next decision and acting once more.